The briefing room at Bagram Airfield fell silent when the intelligence officer tapped the screen. November 2012. Afghanistan's Kunar province. A 12-man special forces team had been pinned down in a valley so remote it didn't have a proper name on any map, just grid coordinates that everyone in the room had already memorized. The Taliban had them surrounded on 3 sides, dug into positions that had been prepared for weeks, maybe months. Mortars, heavy machine guns, RPGs. The kind of defensive network that turned valleys into kill boxes. The team had been holding for 6 hours, but their ammunition was nearly gone, and the medevac couldn't land under that much fire. 2 Apache had already made gun runs, expending everything they had, but the enemy kept coming. The mountains funneled the fight into a narrow corridor where every advantage belonged to the insurgents. The operations officer looked at the roster of available aircraft with the expression of someone doing math that didn't add up. Fast movers were too far out. The Apache were rearming. The only asset within range was a single A-10 Thunderbolt II, Callsign Reaper 6, piloted by Captain Nadia Kauri. The silence in the room changed texture when her name appeared on the screen. Someone coughed. Another officer studied his boots. Captain Darnell, the mission commander, didn't look up from his notepad. Kauri had been in country for 4 months, and in that time she'd flown more sorties than most pilots flew in a year, but she was still the outsider. Still, the one whose presence in the cockpit felt like a social experiment to half the men in the squadron. Her call sign wasn't earned through valor or some memorable incident. It was assigned by a flight lead who thought it was funny, a dark joke about a woman flying a plane designed to kill. She never complained, never corrected anyone. She just flew. The operations officer cleared his throat. Reaper 6 is wheels up in 4 minutes, solo flight. She'll have 30 minutes of playtime before bingo fuel. Playtime. That's what they called close air support when they wanted to strip it of weight. Captain Darnell finally looked up. His jaw was tight. She knows the terrain. She requested the sector 3 weeks ago, studied every ridge. Darnell nodded once, but his eyes didn't meet anyone else's. In the cockpit, Kauri was already running her pre-flight checks, her hands moving over switches and dials with the rhythm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The A-10 sat on the tarmac like a predator built from titanium and spite. Twin turbofan engines mounted high to avoid debris. The 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon slung beneath the nose like a promise. 30mm rounds designed to shred armor. She didn't think about the briefing room. Didn't think about the silence. She thought about the men in the valley who were counting bullets. Kauri taxied toward the runway as the sun dropped behind the Hindu Kush, turning the mountains into black teeth against an orange sky. The tower cleared her without ceremony. Reaper 6, Wines 270 at 8 cleared for takeoff. Reaper 6 rolling. They accelerated down the runway, slower than the F-16s and F-15s that screamed into the sky like missiles, but with a different kind of certainty. This was a plane built to survive, not to impress. Titanium bathtub around the cockpit, redundant flight systems, engines that could take a beating and keep running. Kauri rotated at 130 knots and climbed into the thin mountain air, her eyes scanning the horizon as the base fell away behind her. The radio crackled. Reaper 6, Warlord 1, we're in contact, heavy fire from the North Ridge. Danger close. How copy, Warlord 1, the Special Forces team leader. His voice was steady, but she could hear the edge underneath, the sound of someone who'd already written the after-action report in his head and didn't like the ending. Warlord 1, Reaper 6, good copy, I'm 12 minutes out. Give me your position and marking. We're in a compound grid, November Kilo 376421, marking with IR strobe. Enemy is dug in on the ridge 300 meters north. We've got wounded. Kauri checked her fuel, checked her weapons load. 11 Maverick missiles, full belt of 30mm, enough to make a difference if she was precise, if she was lucky. Warlord 1 understood, stay low, I'm coming in from the south. The valley appeared below her like a scar in the earth, narrow, steep-sided, shadowed. She could see the muzzle flashes on the ridge, tiny bursts of light that marked machine gun positions. The compound was a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by low walls, and in the failing light she could just make out the infrared strobe flashing from the rooftop. 12 men down there, watching the sky. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't Warlord 1. It was Darnell calling from the operations center. Reaper 6, be advised, we're working on additional assets. Do not engage until support arrives. Cowrie's hand hovered over the throttle. She looked at the ridge, at the compound, at the men who were running out of time. Warlord 1, Reaper 6 confirming, you need fires now or can you wait for support? There was a pause. Then Warlord 1's voice came back quieter. Now would be good, Reaper. Cowrie pushed the throttle forward. Warlord 1, I'm rolling in hot. The A-10 dropped into the valley like a stone with wings, descending through 3,000 feet in seconds as Cowrie angled toward the ridge. The HUD painted the targets in green thermal signatures clustered around fighting positions that had been dug into the rock and reinforced with sandbags. She could see the geometry of it now, the way the Taliban had set up interlocking fields of fire to cover every approach to the compound. Smart, disciplined, deadly. She armed the GAU-8, feeling the familiar hum as the cannon spun up. 30mm depleted uranium rounds, 65 per second, designed to turn armored vehicles into scrap. Against entrenched infantry, it was overkill. She didn't care. The first pass came fast. Cowrie rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and squeezed the trigger. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, tearing roar that echoed off the valley walls like the sky splitting open. BRRRRRRRRRT. The ridge erupted in dust and fire as the rounds chewed through rock and sandbags, silencing 2 machine gun positions in a single 3-second burst. Tracers arced up toward her, bright streaks cutting through the dimming light, but the A-10 was already climbing, already banking hard to the left. Cowrie's breathing was steady, controlled. She'd practiced this 100 times in simulators, flown it for real over ranges in Nevada and Arizona, but this was different. This was men trying to kill other men, and she was the variable that could change the equation. Warlord 1, Reaper 6. North Ridge, 2 positions destroyed. How copy? Reaper 6, good hits. We're still taking fire from the east side, dug in near the tree line. Cowrie brought the A-10 around, scanning for the new targets. The tree line was sparse, a few scraggly pines clinging to the slope, but it provided enough concealment for the enemy to reposition. She saw movement, thermal bloom. Another machine gun. She rolled in again, this time from a different angle, and fired. The cannon roared. The tree line disintegrated. In the operations center at Bagram, Captain Darnell stood in front of the live feed from a Predator drone circling high above the valley. The screen showed them making pass after pass, each gun run precise and methodical, walking fire across the ridge in patterns that boxed the enemy into smaller and smaller pockets. An analyst standing beside him muttered, "She's good." Darnell didn't respond. He watched the fuel readout in the corner of the screen drop steadily. Reaper 6 was burning through her playtime faster than planned. The valley was chewing up fuel with every low-altitude turn, every hard bank. She'd have maybe 2 more passes before she had to break off. Cowrie knew the math without checking the gauge. She could feel it in the way the aircraft responded, the way the engines hesitated just slightly when she pushed them. But the radio kept crackling. Warlord 1 kept calling targets, and the men on the ground kept fighting. Reaper 6, Warlord 1, we've got a technical moving up the west road. Looks like a mounted gun. She spotted it immediately. A Toyota pickup with a heavy machine gun welded to the bed, racing toward the compound. The driver was good, using the terrain to mask his approach, but he'd made one mistake. He'd gotten greedy. He'd gotten close. Cowrie didn't use the cannon. She selected a Maverick, locked the target, and fired. The missile streaked downward, smoke trail bright against the darkening sky, and hit the technical dead center. The explosion flipped the truck end over end, scattering debris across the road. Silence. For the first time in 7 hours, the valley went quiet. Warlord 1's voice came over the radio, and this time there was something different in it. Relief, gratitude. Reaper 6, that's a kill. We're clear. I say again, we are clear. Cowrie pulled the A-10 into a climb, her eyes on the fuel gauge. Red warning light. She had maybe 10 minutes before she'd be gliding. Warlord 1, copy. Stay safe down there. Reaper, we owe you. Serious. She didn't answer. She turned the A-10 east toward Bagram and climbed into the thin air above the mountains. Cockpit was quiet except for the hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of radio chatter from other flights. She thought about the technical, about the ridge, about the men who wouldn't be going home because she'd been faster. It wasn't pride, it wasn't satisfaction, it was just the work. The fuel warning chimed, 5 minutes. She ran the numbers in her head, distance to base, altitude, glide ratio. It was going to be close, very close. The tower came over the radio. Reaper 6, Bagram Tower. We have you on radar. Fuel status. Bagram Reaper 6, I'm running on fumes, request priority clearance. Reaper 6 cleared direct, winds 290 at 10, emergency equipment standing by. Cowrie descended through the darkness, the lights of Bagram appearing like a constellation on the valley floor. The engines coughed once, twice. She didn't react. She trimmed the nose, adjusted her glide path, and kept her hand steady on the stick. The runway lights grew brighter. They crossed the threshold at 120 knots, still flying, still fighting gravity. The wheels touched down with a chirp of rubber on concrete, and Cowrie let the plane roll to a stop under its own weight. The engines died. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still on the controls, listening to the silence. Outside, the ground crew was already moving toward her, faces lit by the glow of floodlights. When she climbed down from the cockpit, Captain Darnell was standing on the tarmac. He didn't salute, didn't speak. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then he nodded once before turning back toward the operations building. It wasn't respect, not yet, but it was something. Cowrie walked toward the debriefing room, her flight suit damp with sweat, her hands still steady. Behind her, the A-10 sat on the tarmac like a battered monument, scorched and streaked with carbon from the cannon, fuel dripping from the wing tanks. Still ready, still deadly, still hers. The debriefing lasted 20 minutes. Cowrie recounted every pass, every target, every decision, her voice flat and professional. The intelligence officer took notes. The operations officer asked technical questions about the fuel consumption. No one asked how she felt. When it was over, she walked to her quarters, a cramped plywood hovel with a cot and a locker and nothing else. She sat on the edge of the cot and unlaced her boots, her movements slow and deliberate. On the wall, someone had taped a photograph of an A-10 with the caption, "Ugly but effective." She stared at it for a moment, then lay back and closed her eyes. The next mission was in 8 hours. 3 weeks later, Cowrie was back in the valley. Different grid coordinates, same mountains, same enemy. The team on the ground was a Marine reconnaissance unit, Call St. Havoc 2, pinned down near a riverbed by mortar fire. The weather was worse this time. Low clouds, gusty winds, visibility less than 2 miles. The kind of conditions that grounded most aircraft. The A-10 didn't care. Cowrie flew through the clouds like they were smoke, descending into the valley with her radar altimeter ticking off the distance to the ground in hundreds of feet. Havoc 2's radio chatter was clipped and urgent. Any air assets, this is Havoc 2. We are taking effective fire from the north. Request immediate CAS. Cowrie keyed the radio. Havoc 2, Reaper 6, I'm 2 minutes out. Mark your position. Reaper 6, Havoc 2. We're in the riverbed 500 meters south of the bridge, marking with smoke. The smoke grenade bloomed red against the gray landscape, a single splash of color in the gloom. Cowrie spotted it immediately, adjusted her heading, and rolled in. The mortar position was dug into a hillside, camouflaged with netting and branches. She saw it anyway. The GAU-8 roared. The hillside erupted. Havoc 2's voice came back, breathless. Good hits, we're moving. Cowrie circled overhead, watching the Marines extract under the cover of her presence. She didn't fire again. She didn't need to. The enemy had already broken contact, melting back into the hills like shadows. When she landed at Bagram, the ground crew chief walked around the A-10 with a flashlight, inspecting the undercarriage. He stopped near the left engine nacelle, crouched down, and whistled. "Captain, you took a hit." Cowrie climbed down and looked. There was a hole in the nacelle the size of a fist, jagged and blackened, shrapnel or a lucky shot from a heavy machine gun. The engine had kept running anyway. The crew chief shook his head. "You didn't even notice." "I noticed," Cowrie said. "Just didn't matter." He laughed, a short bark of disbelief, and slapped the fuselage. "Damn right it didn't," word spread. "Not officially. Not through commendations or awards. but through the invisible network that connected pilots and ground crews and forward controllers, the people who lived in the space between policy and practice. Reaper 6 was solid. Reaper 6 got it done. Captain Darnell started assigning her the hardest missions, the ones where the terrain was brutal and the weather was worse, the ones where the margin for error was measured in seconds and feet. She never refused, never hesitated. She just flew. December brought snow to the mountains, and with it a new kind of danger: ice on the wings, clouds that turned valleys into white voids, visibility so poor that flying became an act of faith in instruments and instinct. Cowrie flew anyway. The call came at dawn. A convoy ambushed on the main highway near Jalalabad, 4 vehicles burning, casualties mounting. No air support within range except Reaper 6. Cowrie launched into a sky the color of concrete, the A-10 sluggish in the cold air, ice already forming on the leading edges of the wings. The convoy commander's voice was tight with fear. Reaper 6 Kodiak Actual, we're taking fire from multiple positions. RPG's small arms, we can't move. Kodiak Actual, Reaper 6, I'm 5 minutes out. Stay in your vehicles. She descended through the clouds, breaking into clear air at 800 feet, and saw the highway stretched out below like a scar. The convoy was scattered across the road, 3 Humvees and a supply truck, black smoke pouring from the lead vehicle. Muzzle flashes sparkled from the hills on both sides. Cowrie didn't wait for coordinates. She rolled in and fired. The cannon stitched a line of destruction across the hillside, silencing 2 RPG teams in a single burst. She pulled up, banked hard, and came around for another pass. Second run was lower, riskier. She could see the faces of the insurgents as they scattered, could see them diving for cover as the A-10 screamed overhead. The cannon roared again. The hillside went silent. Kodiak Actual's voice crackled over the radio, shaking. Reaper 6 were moving. Thank you, God, thank you. Cowrie climbed back into the clouds, her hands trembling slightly on the stick, not from fear, from the cold. The cockpit heater was struggling and her fingers were numb inside her gloves. She flexed them, forcing circulation, and turned back toward Bagram. When she landed, the crew chief was waiting. He didn't say anything. He just pointed at the wings, ice, thick enough to add 100 pounds to the aircraft, thick enough to kill a less experienced pilot. Cowrie looked at it, then at him. It melted on the way down. He shook his head, still smiling. You're crazy. Maybe. That night in the officers' club, a shipping container with a coffee pot and a couch that smelled like diesel, Captain Darnell sat down across from her. He didn't look at her, just stared at his coffee. You know they're calling you the Reaper for real now, he said. Cowrie didn't respond. Darnell took a sip, not because of the call sign, because of what you do. She still didn't respond. He set the cup down. I was wrong about you. It was the closest thing to an apology she'd ever get. She nodded once. Okay. Darnell stood up, hesitated, then walked out. Cowrie sat alone in the shipping container, listening to the wind rattle the metal walls, and thought about the men in the convoy, about the Marines in the riverbed, about the Special Forces team in the valley. She thought about the A-10 still sitting on the tarmac waiting for the next mission. She thought about the sky, always the sky. By January, Cowrie had flown 97 sorties, more than any other pilot in the squadron. More than most pilots flew in an entire deployment. The A-10 she flew, tail number 80244, had become a legend in its own right. The ground crews painted small kill marks on the fuselage beneath the cockpit, one for each confirmed enemy position destroyed. They stopped counting at 30. The aircraft was scarred and scorched, patches of fresh paint covering bullet holes and shrapnel damage, but it flew like it was brand new. The crew chief, a staff sergeant named Alvarez, treated it like a holy relic. This bird's got a guardian angel, he told Cowrie one morning while inspecting the landing gear. Cowrie didn't believe in angels. She believed in hydraulics and titanium and redundant flight systems. But she didn't argue. The missions kept coming. A farmhouse occupied by a Taliban commander, a mountain pass where insurgents had set up a roadblock, a village where enemy fighters were using civilians as shields, forcing Cowrie to make passes so low and so precise that she could see the expressions on people's faces. Every time she delivered. Every time she came back. The other pilots in the squadron started asking her questions. Not about tactics or procedures. Those were in the manuals. They asked about the things that couldn't be written down. How do you stay calm when the tracers are coming up and the fuel warning is screaming and the radio is full of voices calling for help? How do you make the decision to fire when the target is close enough to your own guys that the margin for error is measured in feet? How do you land an aircraft that's leaking fuel and running on one engine and still make it look easy? Cowrie answered the questions the same way every time. You do the work, you don't think about anything else. It wasn't wisdom. It wasn't inspiration. It was just the truth. One night, a young lieutenant named Vasquez, fresh out of flight school, still nervous in the cockpit, sat down next to her in the chow hall. "Captain, can I ask you something?" Cowrie looked up from her tray. "Go ahead." "How do you handle the fear?" She considered the question. She thought about the first time she'd flown into combat, the way her heart had hammered in her chest, the way her hands had shaken on the stick. She thought about the way it had faded over time, not disappearing but transforming into something else. Focus, clarity, purpose. "You don't handle it," she said. "You just keep flying." Vasquez nodded slowly, but his eyes were uncertain. Cowrie set down her fork. "The fear means you're paying attention. It means you understand what's at stake. The day it stops scaring you is the day you get someone killed." Vasquez thought about that. "Does it still scare you?" "Every time." He seemed relieved. "Thank you, ma'am." Cowrie watched him walk away, and for a moment she felt something unfamiliar. Not pride exactly, but something close. February brought a new mission, not close air support, not a rescue, something different. Intelligence had located a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. He was holed up in a compound near the Pakistani border, surrounded by fighters, dug in deep. The mission was a night raid. Special forces would go in on foot, supported by helicopters and drones. Cowrie's role was overwatch. She launched at midnight, the sky black and moonless, the A-10 climbing into the darkness like a ghost. The compound appeared on her targeting screen as a cluster of heat signatures, bright against the cold ground. She could see the assault team moving in from the south, silent and fast. The radio was quiet. Everyone knew their role. Then the shooting started. The Taliban had anticipated the raid, set up ambush positions in the surrounding buildings. The assault team was pinned down before they even reached the compound. Cowrie didn't wait for orders. She rolled in, her targeting pod locked on the nearest machine gun nest, and fired a Maverick. The building disintegrated in a flash of white light. The assault team moved forward. Another machine gun opened up from a rooftop. Cowrie fired again. The mission lasted 17 minutes. When it was over, the high-value target was dead, the assault team was intact, and the compound was rubble. The team leader radioed from the ground, his voice calm. "Reaper 6, Sabre 1. "That was textbook. Well done." Cowrie didn't respond. She turned the A-10 north toward Bagram and flew through the darkness in silence. When she landed, Alvarez was waiting. He looked at the aircraft, then at her. "How many Mavericks left?" "3." He nodded. "You're running out of toys." "I'll make them count." He laughed. "I know you will." The debriefing was different this time. The operations officer was there. The squadron commander was there. And so was a Colonel Cowrie had never seen before, a man with a chest full of ribbons and the kind of presence that made everyone sit up straighter. He didn't introduce himself. He just looked at her. "Captain Cowrie, I've been reading your after-action reports." Cowrie said nothing. The colonel leaned back in his chair. "You've flown more combat sorties in 4 months than most pilots fly in a career. You've logged more gun runs than anyone in this theater. And you've done it without a single friendly fire incident, without a single mission failure." He paused. "That's not luck, that's skill." Cowrie met his eyes. "I just do the job, sir." The colonel smiled faintly. "I know, that's why I'm here." He stood up. "You're being reassigned, effective immediately. You'll be training the next generation of A-10 pilots at Nellis Air Force Base. Combat experience like yours is too valuable to waste." Cowrie felt something cold settle in her chest. "Sir, I'd prefer to stay in theater." "I'm sure you would, but this isn't a request, Captain, it's an order." The room was silent. The colonel walked to the door, then paused. "You've done enough, Cowrie. Let someone else carry the weight for a while." He left. Cowrie sat in the empty briefing room, staring at the wall. 2 weeks later, Cowrie stood on the tarmac at Bagram for the last time. The A-10 tail number 80244 was being prepped for its next pilot, a captain named Hendricks who just arrived in country. Alvarez was there, supervising the maintenance crew, his hands black with grease. Cowrie walked over. "Take care of her." Alvarez looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "You know I will," she nodded. She wanted to say something else, something about what the aircraft had meant to her, about the missions they'd flown together, but the words didn't come. Alvarez seemed to understand. "She's a good bird, best I've ever worked on. But it wasn't the plane, Captain, it was you." Cowrie's throat tightened. She turned away before he could see her face. The flight back to the States was long and empty. She sat in the back of a C-17, surrounded by cargo pallets and sleeping soldiers, and stared out the window at the mountains disappearing below. She thought about Warlord 1, about Havoc 2, about Kodiak Actual, about all the voices on the radio who'd called for help and gotten it. She thought about the men who were still down there, still fighting, still waiting for air support that might not come. She thought about the new pilots who'd take her place, and she hoped they'd be ready. Nellie's Air Force Base was a different world, clean, organized, safe. The A-10 squadron there was full of instructors and students, all of them eager to learn from the pilot who'd become a legend in Afghanistan. Cowrie didn't feel like a legend. She felt like someone who'd left the fight unfinished. The first day of class, she stood in front of 20 young pilots and looked at their faces. They were bright, confident, untested. "You're here to learn how to fly the A-10 in combat," she said. "I'm here to make sure you survive it." She spent the next 6 months teaching them everything she knew: how to read the terrain, how to communicate with ground forces, how to manage fuel and weapons and fear, how to make split-second decisions that could save lives or end them. The students listened. They took notes. They asked questions, but Cowrie could see the doubt in some of their eyes, the unspoken question. What does she know that we don't? She knew the answer. She knew what it felt like to fly into a valley where the sky was full of tracers and the radio was full of screaming. She knew what it felt like to make a gun run so low that you could see the enemy's faces. She knew what it felt like to land with the fuel gauge on zero and the engines coughing, and the knowledge that one mistake would have killed you. She knew what it cost. One afternoon, a student named Carmichael approached her after class. He was tall, confident, the kind of pilot who'd probably aced every simulation. "Captain, can I ask you something?" Cowrie looked up from her notes. "Sure. Is it true you flew a mission on fumes, like actually ran out of fuel on final approach?" Cowrie nodded. "Once." "How did you stay calm?" She thought about that flight, about the valley, about the men on the ground. "I didn't have a choice. They needed me to land, so I landed." Carmichael frowned. "But what if you'd crashed?" "Then I would have crashed, but the mission would have been complete." He stared at her, trying to reconcile the answer with the woman standing in front of him. Cowrie closed her notebook. "The aircraft is tough. The systems are redundant, but none of that matters if you're not willing to push through the fear and do the job. That's what separates the pilots who make it from the ones who don't." Carmichael nodded slowly. "Thank you, ma'am." After he left, Cowrie stood alone in the empty classroom, looking out the window at the flight line. The A-10s sat in neat rows, pristine and ready, their weapons pylons empty. They looked wrong without the scorch marks, without the history. She missed the fight. A year passed. Cowrie trained 3 classes of pilots, sending them off to squadrons around the world. Some went to Afghanistan, some went to Iraq, some went to bases in Europe and Asia, waiting for the next war. She heard stories. One of her students had saved a convoy in Helmand Province. Another had flown through a sandstorm to reach a Marine unit under fire. A third had taken shrapnel in the cockpit and still completed the mission. She felt proud, and she felt restless. In the spring of 2014, Cowrie received orders. She was being promoted to major and reassigned to a staff position at the Pentagon. A desk job, policy work. The kind of assignment that meant her flying days were over. She read the orders twice, then folded the paper and put it in her desk drawer. That night she drove out to the flight line and stood beneath an A-10, looking up at the cannon and the engines and the wings that had carried her through so many missions. The crew chief on duty, a young airman she didn't recognize, walked over. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "Just looking." He followed her gaze. "You ever fly one of these?" "A few times," he grinned. "They're ugly as hell, but I hear they're tough." "Toughest plane in the Air Force," Cowery said. She stayed there for an hour, alone with the aircraft, remembering the valleys and the mountains and the voices on the radio. When she finally walked away, she didn't look back. The Pentagon was everything she'd expected. Meetings, briefings, PowerPoint presentations, discussions about budgets and force structure and political considerations that had nothing to do with the reality of combat. Cowery hated it, but she did the work. She wrote reports. She testified before congressional committees. She argued for the A-10's continued existence when other officers wanted to retire the fleet in favor of newer, faster, more expensive aircraft. She became the voice for the plane that had saved her life and the lives of countless others. It wasn't flying, but it mattered. One day she was called into a meeting with a two-star general she'd never met. He was reviewing a proposal to cut the A-10 program entirely, reallocating the funds to the F-35. "Major Cowery," he said, "I've read your memo. You make a compelling case, but the reality is that the A-10 is old. It's slow. It's not survivable in a modern air defense environment." Cowery leaned forward. "With respect, sir, the A-10 isn't designed to fight in a modern air defense environment. It's designed to fight in the places where air defenses don't matter, where the enemy is on the ground, dug in and close to our troops. It's designed to survive damage and keep flying. It's designed to save lives." The general frowned. "You're emotionally invested in this aircraft." "Yes, sir, I am, because I've seen what it can do. I've flown it in combat. I've watched it take hits that would have downed any other plane and keep fighting, and I've listened to the voices of the men on the ground who are alive because of it." The general was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll take your recommendation under advisement." The meeting ended. Cowery walked out of the Pentagon into the bright Virginia sunlight and wondered if she'd made a difference. 6 months later, the decision came down. The A-10 program would continue, not because of her memo, not because of any one person, but because enough people had fought for it, had argued for its value, had refused to let it die. Cowery read the announcement in her office, and for the first time in years she smiled. That night, she went home to her small apartment in Arlington and opened a bottle of bourbon. She didn't drink often, but this felt like an occasion. She poured a glass, sat on the couch, and thought about Alvarez and Warlord 1 and Havoc 2 and all the others whose names she'd never know. She thought about the A-10, still flying, still fighting. She raised the glass. "To the hog," she said quietly, and drank. The years passed. Cowery served at the Pentagon. She was promoted to lieutenant colonel. She became one of the senior voices on close air support doctrine, respected by peers and subordinates alike. But she never flew again, not in combat, not where it mattered. She retired in 2021 after 22 years of service. The ceremony was small. A few colleagues. A few friends. No family. She'd never had time for that. The general who presented her retirement medal gave a short speech about her service, her dedication, her impact on the Air Force. Cowery stood at attention, listened, and felt nothing. When it was over, she walked out of the Pentagon for the last time and drove west. She didn't have a plan. She just drove. She ended up in Nevada near Nellie's and rented a house on the edge of the desert. She spent her days hiking and reading and trying to figure out what came next. One afternoon, she drove onto the base and walked out to the flight line. The A-10s were still there, still flying, still ugly and tough and indispensable. A crew chief was working on one of the aircraft and Cowery walked over. "Mind if I take a look?" The crew chief glanced up, saw the retired insignia on her jacket and nodded. "Go ahead, ma'am." Cowery climbed up to the cockpit and looked inside. The instruments were the same, the stick was the same, the smell was the same, oil and hydraulic fluid and something else, something indefinable. She sat in the seat and put her hands on the controls. For a moment she was back in the valley, back in the fight. Then she climbed down and walked away. The crew chief called after her. "You used to fly these?" Cowery stopped. "Yeah." "What was it like?" She looked back at the aircraft, silhouetted against the desert sky. It was everything. In 2023, Cowery received a letter from a veteran named Rodriguez. He'd been part of Warlord 1, the Special Forces team she'd saved in 2012. He tracked her down through military records and wanted to thank her. The letter was short, simple. "You saved my life. I have a wife now, 2 kids. I think about that day sometimes, and I think about you. Thank you." Cowrie read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. She didn't respond. She didn't know what to say, but she kept the letter. A few months later, she received another one, then another. Veterans from missions she barely remembered, writing to tell her what her actions had meant. A Marine from the convoy near Jalalabad. A pilot she'd trained at Nelly's who'd gone on to fly combat missions in Syria. A crew chief who'd worked on her aircraft and wanted her to know that 800244 was still flying, still racking up missions. Cowrie didn't keep all the letters, but she kept some. In the fall of 2024, she was invited to speak at an air power symposium in Washington. The topic was the future of close air support. She almost declined, but something made her say yes. The auditorium was full. Pilots, analysts, policymakers, all of them debating the merits of drones and precision munitions and networked warfare. Cowrie listened to the presentations, and then it was her turn. She walked to the podium, looked out at the audience, and spoke. "I flew the A-10 in combat for 4 months. In that time, I learned that close air support isn't about technology. It's not about sensors or weapons or speed. It's about the relationship between the pilot and the people on the ground. It's about trust." She paused. "The men I supported didn't care what kind of plane I was flying. They cared that I showed up, that I stayed, that I was willing to fly low and slow and dangerous to get the job done. That's what the A-10 does. That's what it's always done. And if we lose that, if we replace it with something faster or stealthier or more expensive, we'll lose something irreplaceable." The room was silent. Cowrie stepped down from the podium and walked out. She didn't wait for questions. She didn't wait for applause. She just left. Outside, the November air was cold and sharp. She stood on the steps of the building, looking up at the sky, and thought about the valleys and the mountains and the radio chatter and the men who were still out there, still fighting. She thought about the A-10. Always the A-10. A voice behind her said, "Major Cowrie." She turned. A young Air Force captain stood there, nervous and eager. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am, but I just wanted to say I read about your service, about your missions. You're the reason I wanted to fly the A-10. Cowrie looked at him. "What's your name?" "Captain Ellis, ma'am." "You in combat yet?" "Deploying next month, Afghanistan." Cowrie nodded. "Listen to the ground forces, trust your training, and don't be afraid to get low." Ellis smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He walked away, and Cowrie stood alone on the steps watching him go. The sky was clear. The air was cold, and somewhere far away an A-10 was flying. In the spring of 2025, Cowrie returned to Afghanistan, not as a pilot, as a consultant. The Department of Defense had contracted her to evaluate close air support operations and provide recommendations for improvement. She landed at Bagram in April, stepping off the transport into air that smelled like dust and diesel and memory. The base had changed. New buildings, new faces, but the mountains were the same. The sky was the same. She spent 2 weeks embedded with a Special Forces unit, watching their operations, observing the coordination between ground forces and air support. The pilots were good, competent, professional, but something was missing. One night she sat with the team leader, a captain named Ortiz, in a makeshift operations center. "You ever work with an A-10 pilot?" she asked. Ortiz shook his head. "Mostly drones and fast movers. The hogs are around, but they're not usually assigned to our missions." "Why not?" he shrugged. "Hire wants precision, speed. The A-10's seen as old school." Cowrie didn't argue. But that night she wrote a report. She detailed the value of the A-10 in close air support. She explained the psychological impact of having a pilot overhead who could stay in the fight, who could communicate, who could adapt. She argued that precision wasn't just about hitting the target, it was about understanding the battlefield. The report went to the Pentagon. She didn't know if anyone read it. A week before she was scheduled to leave, Cowrie stood on the tarmac at Bagram and watched an A-10 land. The pilot climbed out, a young woman, maybe 26, her flight suit dark with sweat. Walked over to the crew chief, laughing about something, and Cowrie saw herself. 10 years younger, still fearless, still hungry. The pilot noticed Cowrie watching and walked over. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Cowrie smiled. "Just watching, you're doing good work." The pilot grinned. Thank you, it's the best job in the world. I know, Cowery said. The pilot walked away and Cowery stood there alone on the tarmac as the sun set behind the mountains. The A-10 sat nearby, scarred and scorched and ready. Always ready. Cowery thought about Rodriguez's letter, about Ellis deploying, about all the pilots and ground forces and crew chiefs who kept the fight going year after year, mission after mission. She thought about legacy, not her own. The A-10s, the plane that wouldn't die, the plane that kept saving lives, the plane that mattered. She turned and walked back toward the operations building, and as she did, she heard the sound of engines spooling up. Another A-10, another mission. Another pilot heading into the sky. Cowery didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew what was out there, and she knew it would endure.